happy to have been invited to Miami. It isn't my first trip, but the first one was so long ago that it really feels as though it is, because it looks so different, and I am assured by those of you who live here that it is indeed different from what it was 25 years ago. And I'm also pleased to have been invited to the book fair in Miami. It's an extraordinary series that seems to be taking place in a number of cities and countries, and they are extremely valuable and important to authors as well as booksellers in the community. As a matter of fact, if I hadn't been attending a book fair in Barcelona, I'm sure I wouldn't be here, because it was there that I met your executive director, Jillian, who persuaded me to come to Miami. And I'm grateful to her and for the others who participated in this warm welcome and the structure of the affair. What I hope to do tonight is talk a little bit about my work, what I think it is about, and also to read a little bit from something that I have not yet published, and then to make myself available to you for questions if there are any. So with that simple format in mind, I'd like to begin by describing to you something that has emerged as a kind of raison d'etre, as well as a philosophy for the writing that I do. It's all blazing hindsight, because when I began to write, I was not disciplined but extremely compelled, and which is something that can serve just as well as discipline if the compulsion is given free rein. I had not planned to be a writer, and I had not thought about it as a career. I don't remember being given any career counseling. I remember feeling that I would have the absolute necessity to have a job. And with the limitations that were placed upon us, I thought that I would be very happy if I were able to teach school, which I did for a while, and then went into publishing. And it was there that I began to fill up evening time with writing a story that I had sort of begun much earlier as, not seriously, in a way of entertaining myself, and then began to complete it. But when I began to write on a regular basis, that is what I thought was a regular basis, and the first book I wrote took a long, long time, and it's easily the shortest book I've ever written, I knew that I didn't want to not write, or I didn't want to ever be in a place where I had no idea for something to write, where I could not mull, chew, nudge, examine with a writing idea, as well as to shape it, so that the idea of the kind of writing I wanted to do didn't come, obviously, in a blaze at the beginning. I did not recognize even having a style until I wrote the third book. I thought that the style that I wrote each book before that was the style that was demanded by the text, by the idea, by the plot. And by the time I had gotten around to the third book, then it occurred to me that there was a way in which I seemed to choose language and structure in order to reveal certain things. At any rate, starting with the first book, getting clearer about it in the second book, and still in process of finding out what it is that makes it the second most important thing in my life. And I have done what artists do, is gotten very interested in shaping my whole perception of the art by doing it. I know that my early ideas were simply that there were no books about people like me, although I did not articulate it that way at the time. I knew that young black girls were of no interest to anybody in literature. And I spent all of my life reading and don't remember my life before I was able to read. And nevertheless, whenever I encountered such a person, that person was somebody else's straight man or prop or background or joke, and never center stage, and certainly never taken seriously. That was, in a simple way, what I was concerned about, but there were some other things that were of vital interest to me when I constructed the first book I wrote, The Bluest Eye. The second thing being, I didn't want to write a book in which there were all these implicit footnotes to people who were not like me in order to explain it all. I wanted it to have its own intimacy, its own address, like everybody's literature does, and not to constantly editorialize and explain over and over again. That simply led me in a certain kind of experimentation with oral, the sound of language. And I began in the second book to feel stronger about it. I felt that there's a possibility that there was something that could be called black literature. And all the definitions that I had ever heard were unsatisfactory, because it seemed to me that it only meant that the person who wrote the text had to be black, or it meant that the subject matter would be about black people. And there were other variations on that theme, but I thought it's interesting that everybody recognizes what black music is, whether it's gospel, jazz, spiritual, or what have you. And whether it's Miles Davis or Duke Ellington, it doesn't matter, or Louis Armstrong. The styles can vary as wide as it is possible, but there was something recognizable in it, period. And it was that analogy that was useful to me. So I was struggling, and am struggling, for that essence that would make the book irrevocably culture-bound. And that culture-bound quality would not depend on necessarily my skin or even the people in the book. There would be something that would make it irrevocably a book that could be called black fiction, no matter what I was talking about. And then, obviously, I had to use the analogy of music, but I had to convert that into terms that were purely literary. So I looked to the art itself, and there seemed to be certain characteristics that were that distinguished it. I used the relationship of the artist to the audience, of the minister to his congregation, in the sense that I expect the reader to participate very closely in the text. I expect a visceral as well as an intellectual response from him. And of course, if I expect it, then I have to shape it. I also wanted to rely on the mythology that was embedded in the stories in the folklore, the cultural stories, because they seem to me not to be, they seem to me to be what mythology is. It's both history and prophecy, and it is special, and it is designed in a particular way that makes it of vital interest to the culture that bears it, but also of some, there are echoes for those that are attuned to it. So that source of information was where I would go for the ideas, not the plot ideas, but the undergirding, the subtext for the work. It seemed to me also that there was some relationship that we had, that black people had with ancestors, that was special. Didn't mean it's better, just special. And that the ancestor was a peculiar kind of person, not a parent or even a grandparent. It didn't even have to be a relative. But it seemed to me that in life as well as in the texts, that there was a blessing available to a character only insofar as he made a healthy connection with the ancestor. And I found it to be applicable in lots of books that were certainly better than mine, that had been written by black people, whether or not there was this respect of this person who was a guiding, benevolent, but strict presence in the life of one of the characters. And when there was no connection, when there was a disconnection, then all was askew. Tragedy was likely to occur, and that it wasn't really the connection between the difficulties that were presented by the society. It was also the cord and the connection between life force that came from that place and another. Well, there were others, but what I tried to do and what I am thinking about, in addition to developing plot and character, is this language that exists in the spaces and the subtext and the ground out of which I work. It led me in Song of Solomon to elaborate on a simple statement that I had always heard since I was a little girl about black people being able to fly at will, with some concentration, of course, before they came to this country and lost it here for various reasons, one of which I gather is because we ate salt. When one looked at the literature, you read all those slave narratives and WPA books and so on, and the interviewers were always asking a certain set category of questions about ghosts and death and whatever. And they said to everyone, have you ever heard of people flying? And of all the people they spoke to, nobody said, what do you mean? Or fly. Everybody said, well, I never saw it, but I heard somebody who, or yes, I saw it. No one was shocked by the stupidity of the question. Everybody had it was not news. Well, for me, every culture has a powerful relationship to flight. And the story of flight figures in practically every culture there is. And it is substance of our dreams. What I was interested in doing was to see the way in which it operated in my culture. What was meant when it was used in spirituals? Was it really escape? Was it death? Was it literal? What was it? And it was in thinking of those questions that I began to shape the idea of what, in literary terms, what that metaphor could mean, which would mean the ability to trust an element that was untrustworthy and to do something that should have been impossible, and what you needed for that. And what you need, of course, is an enormous amount of intelligence, an enormous amount of faith, an enormous knowledge about the self, an enormous amount of love and compassion. So it became a metaphor for the growth of a man from a position of ignorance to an epiphany, which is what the Song of Solomon was about. When I got to Tar Baby, I was interested in something quite similar, not similar to that particular story, but I also was concerned about the Tar Baby story, which I had heard from a woman, my mother, who had heard it from her mother, who had heard it from her mother, and had not read it. I mean, I had not read the versions of it that were available to me or people younger than me. And there was something in it, even though I knew it as a children's story, and it was supposed to make me laugh, there was something extremely unsettling about it and something almost frightening. At any rate, it doesn't matter about my responses to it as a child or as an adult. What does matter is that I was interested in what was in there that bothered me, what was in there that disturbed me. And it was in looking through that tapestry and relying very closely on my own memory of it that surfaced an idea about rearranging that constellation of characters, the farmer, the rabbit, and the tar baby, and dressing them up in modern clothes as a modern parable, although it was an ancient idea. Now, I have brought myself up to date, and without going into a great deal of detail about what provoked me to start another text, except to say that it was again some incident that was extraordinary, it seemed to me extraordinary, and coupled with perhaps others that nagged me enough and or floated around off and on in front of my eyes. And the trick usually is something is really nagging you and becomes, it's so difficult to resolve it. That's generally something you ought to pay very, very close attention to. And in considering this event, I began to work on another text, from which I would like to read a few short pages to you tonight, and then, as I said, open up this evening for questions. And I want to describe just a little bit to you about the book so that it'll be a little bit more understandable than it would be without. Lots of people complain bitterly about the way my books end. I think they end at just the right moment. And I'm maybe in a minority on that score. But I think that a book shouldn't end. I think it ought to close, just sort of close, but that you don't want to slam the door shut. I don't want to tie everything up very neatly, because part of my notion is that, at least in the stories I heard as a child, the endings were always a little bit open. Not only were they open, we were invited to fix them and change them and end them and repeat them and change them again, because we heard the same stories over and over again, and then we eventually graduated to be able to tell them ourselves. And there was a kind of a moral, but there was none of this slam, this is what it means. It had this openness, and it was a little sly, and it also had some double entendre at the end. So that's another one of the characteristics of literature that I think should function, at least in my version of what black literature is. And I always know the ending at the beginning. Well, I said all of that to say that I have to set this up for you a little bit, because the beginnings are a little bit more complicated than the end. I always know the ending because I always know what it's about. But the beginnings are difficult. As a matter of fact, there are lots of people who have never completed novels because they can't get the perfect beginning. And I will tell you, if there are those of you here who are still working on your novels, don't worry about it. Go to the part you know. And you can always do the ending when you finish. So, but my endings have some other necessity, so that it's sometimes I would like to get the reader in real fast and make it impossible for him to stop reading. But that doesn't always work. May not always work. So I want to describe to you some things so that I will have the illusion of having gotten your attention immediately, so that you won't have to stumble through. This manuscript takes place in the middle of the 19th century. Middle in around 20 years, 1855 to 1875, something like that. The major character is a woman named Setha. And she has a daughter named Denver. And she lives in a house in Cincinnati. And I am going to read to you the opening of the text, and hope that the time, the place, and the names of the major characters will be sufficient for your understanding. One, two, four was spiteful, full of a baby's venom. The women in the house knew it, and so did the children. For years, each put up with the spite in his own way. But by 1873, Setha and her daughter, Denver, were its only victims. The grandmother, baby Suggs, was dead, and the sons, Howard and Bugler, had run away by the time they were 13 years old. As soon as merely looking in a mirror shattered it, that was the signal for Bugler. As soon as 2 tiny handprints appeared in the cake, that was it for Howard. Neither boy waited to see more. Another kettle full of chickpeas smoking in a heap on the floor. Soda crackers crumbled and strewn in a line next to the doorsill. Nor did they wait for one of the relief periods, the weeks, months even, when nothing was disturbed. No. Each one fled at once. The moment the house committed what was for him the one insult not to be borne or witnessed a second time. Within 2 months, in the dead of winter, leaving their grandmother, baby Suggs, Setha, their mother, and their little sister Denver, all by themselves in a gray and white house on Bluestone Road. It didn't have a number then, because Cincinnati didn't stretch that far. In fact, Ohio had been calling itself a state only 70 years when first one brother and then the next stuffed quilt packing into his hat, snatched up his shoes, and crept away from the lively spite the house felt for them. Baby Suggs didn't even raise her head. From her sick bed she heard them go, but that wasn't the reason she lay still. It was a wonder to her that her grandsons had taken so long to realize that every house wasn't like the one on Bluestone Road. Suspended between the nastiness of life and the meanness of the dead, she couldn't get interested in leaving life or living it, let alone the fright of 2 creeping off boys. Her past had been like her present, intolerable, and since she knew death was anything but forgetfulness, she used the little energy left her for pondering color. Would you bring a little lavender in if you got any? Pink, if you don't. And Setha would oblige her with anything from fabric to her own. Winter in Ohio was especially rough if you had an appetite for color. Sky provided the only drama, and counting on a Cincinnati horizon for life's principal joy was reckless indeed. So Setha and the girl Denver did what they could and what the house permitted for her. Together they waged a perfunctory battle against the outrageous behavior of that place, against turned-over slop jars, smacks on the behind, and gusts of sour air. For they understood the source of the outrage as well as they knew the source of light. Baby Suggs died shortly after the brothers left, with no interest whatsoever in their leave-taking or hers, and right afterwards, Setha and Denver decided to end the persecution by calling forth the ghost that tried them so. Perhaps a conversation, they thought. An exchange of views or something would help. So they held hands and said, "Come on, come on. You may as well just come on." The sideboard took a step forward, but nothing else did. "Grandma Baby must be stopping it," said Denver. She was 10 and still mad at Baby Suggs for dying. Setha opened her eyes. "I doubt that," she said. "Well, then why don't it come?" "You're forgetting how little it is," said her mother. "She wasn't even 2 years old when she died. Too little to understand, too little to talk much even." "Maybe she don't want to understand," said Denver. "Maybe, but if she'd only come, I could make it clear to her." Setha released her daughter's hand, and together they pushed the sideboard back against the wall. Outside, a driver whipped his horse into the gallop local people felt necessary when they passed 124. "For a baby, she throws a powerful spell," said Denver. "No more powerful than the way I loved her," Setha answered. And there it was again, the welcoming cool of unchiseled headstones, the one she selected to lean against on tiptoe, her knees wide open as any grave. Pink as a fingernail it was, and sprinkled with glittering chips. 10 minutes, he said. "You got 10 minutes. I'll do it for free." 10 minutes for 7 letters. With another 10, could she have gotten dearly, too? She had not thought to ask him, and it bothered her still that it might have been possible that for 20 minutes, a half hour, say, she could have had the whole thing, every word she heard the preacher say at the funeral, all there was to say, really, engraved on her baby's headstone, "Dearly beloved." But what she got, settled for, was the one word that mattered. She thought it would be enough. Rutting among the headstones with the engraver, his young son looking on, the anger in his face so old, the appetite in it quite new. That should certainly be enough. Enough to answer one more preacher, one more abolitionist, and a town full of disgust. Counting on the stillness of her own soul, she had forgotten the other one, the soul of her baby girl. Who would have thought that a little old baby could harbor so much rage? Rutting among the stones under the eyes of the engraver's son was not enough. Not only did she have to live out her years in a house palsied by the baby's fury at having its throat cut, but those 10 minutes she spent pressed up against dawn-colored stone, studded with star chips, her knees wide open as the grave, were longer than life, more alive, more pulsating than the baby blood that soaked her fingers like oil. "We could move," she suggested once to her mother-in-law. "Oh, what be the point?" asked Baby Suggs. "Isn't that a house in the country ain't packed to its rafters with some dead Negro's grief? We lucky this ghost is a baby. If my husband's spirit was to come back in here, or yours, don't talk to me, you lucky. You got 3 left, 3 pulling at your skirts and just 1 raising hell from the other side. Be thankful, why don't you? I had 8, every one of them gone away from me. 4 taken, 4 chased, and all I expect worrying somebody's house into evil. Baby Suggs rubbed her eyebrows. My firstborn, all I can remember of her is how she loved the burned bottom of bread. Can you beat that? 8 children, and that's all I remember. That's all you let yourself remember, Setha had told her. But she was down to 1 herself, 1 alive, that is, the boys chased off by the dead one, and her memory of Bugler was fading fast. Howard at least had a head shape nobody could forget. As for the rest, she worked hard to remember as close to nothing as was safe. Unfortunately, her brain was devious. She might be hurrying across a field, running practically, to get to the pump quickly and rinse the chamomile sap from her legs. Nothing else would be in her mind. The picture of the men coming to nurse her was as lifeless as the nerves in her back, where the skin buckled like a washboard. Nor was there the faintest scent of ink or the cherry gum and oak bark from which it was made. Nothing, just the breeze cooling her face as she rushed toward water, and then sopping the chamomile away with pump water and rags, her mind fixed on getting every last bit of sap off, on her carelessness in taking a shortcut across the field just to save a half mile, and not noticing how high the weeds had grown until the itching was all the way to her knees. Then something, plash of water, the sight of her shoes and stockings awry on the path where she had flung them, or here boy lapping in the puddle near her feet. And suddenly there was Sweet Home, rolling, rolling, rolling out before her eyes. And although there was not a leaf on that farm that did not make her want to scream, it rolled itself out before her in shameless beauty. It never looked as terrible as it was, and it made her wonder if hell was a pretty place too. Fire and brimstone, all right, but hidden in lacy groves. Boys hanging from the most beautiful sycamores in the world. It shamed her, remembering the wonderful soughing trees rather than the boys. Try as she might to make it otherwise, the sycamores beat out the children every time, and she could not forgive her memory for that. When the last of the chamomile was gone, she went around to the front of the house collecting her shoes and stockings on the way. As if to punish her further for her terrible memories, sitting on the porch not 40 feet away was Paul D., the last of the Sweet Home men. And although she could never mistake his face for another's, she said, "Is that you?" "What's left?" He stood up and smiled. "How you been, girl, besides barefoot?" When she laughed, it came out loose and young. "I messed up my legs back yonder in the chamomile." He made a face as though tasting a teaspoon of something bitter. "I don't want to even hear about it. I always did hate that stuff." Setha balled up her stockings and jammed them into her pocket. "Come on in." "The porch is fine, Setha. It's cool out here." He sat back down and looked at the meadow on the other side of the road, knowing the eagerness he felt would be in his eyes. 18 years, she said softly. 18, he repeated, "and I swear I've been walking every one of them. Mind if I join you?" He nodded toward her feet and began unlacing his shoes. "You want to soak 'em? Let me get you a basin of water." She moved closer to him to enter the house. "No, can't baby feet. Whole lot more tramping they got to do yet." "You can't leave right away, Paul D. You got to stay a while." "Well, long enough to see baby Suggs anyway. Where is she?" "Dead." "Oh, no. When?" 8 years now, almost 9. "Was it hard?" "I hope she didn't die hard." Setha shook her head. "Soft as cream. Being alive was the hard part. Sorry you missed her, though. Is that what you came by for?" Well, that's some of what I came by for. The rest is you. But if all the truth be known, I go anywhere these days, anywhere they let me sit down. You're looking good. Devil's confusion. He lets me look good long as I feel bad. He looked at her and the word bad took on another meaning. Setha smiled. This is the way they were, had been, all of the Sweet Home men. Before and after Hallie treated her to a mild, brotherly flirtation, so subtle you had to scratch for it. Except for a heap more hair and some waiting in his eyes, he looked the way he had in Kentucky, peach stone skin, straight back. For a man with an immobile face, it was amazing how ready it was to smile or blaze or be sorry with you, as though all he had to do was get his attention, and right away he produced the feeling you were feeling. With less than a blink, his face seemed to change. Underneath it lay the activity. I wouldn't have to ask about him, would I? You'd tell me if there was anything to tell, wouldn't you? Setha looked down at her feet and saw again the sycamores. I'd tell you, sure I'd tell you. I don't know any more now than I did then. You must think he's still alive. No, I think he's dead. It's not being sure that keeps him alive. Well, what did baby Suggs think? Same, but to listen to her, all her children is dead. Claims she felt each one go the very day and hour. Well, when did she say Hallie went? 1855, the day my baby was born. You had that baby, did you? I never thought you'd make it, he chuckled. Running off, pregnant. Had to. Couldn't be no waiting. She lowered her head and thought, as he did, how unlikely it was that she'd made it. And if it hadn't been for that girl looking for velvet, she never would have. All by yourself, too. He was proud of her and annoyed by her. Proud she had done it, annoyed that she had not needed Hallie or him in the doing. Almost by myself, not all by myself. A white girl helped me. Well, then she helped herself, too, God bless her. You could stay the night, Paul D. You don't sound too steady in the offer. Setha glanced beyond his shoulder toward the closed door. Oh, it's truly men. I just hope you pardon my house. Come on in. Talk to Denver while I cook you something. Paul D. tied his shoes together, hung them over his shoulder, and followed her through the door, straight into a pool of red and undulating light that locked him where he stood. You got company, he whispered, frowning. Off and on, said Setha. Good God. He backed out the door onto the porch. What kind of evil you got in here? It's not evil, it's just sad. Come on, just step through. He looked at her closely then, closer than he had when she first rounded the house on wet and shining legs, holding her shoes and stockings up in one hand, her skirts in the other. Hallie's girl, the one with the iron eyes and backbone to match. He'd never seen her hair in Kentucky. And though her face was 18 years older than when he last saw her, it was softer now because of the hair, a face too still for comfort. Irises the same color of her skin, which in that still face used to make him think of a mask with mercifully punched out eyes. Hallie's woman, pregnant every year. In 2 years she sat by the fire, telling him she was going to run. Her 3 children she had already packed into a wagon load of others in a caravan of Negroes crossing the river. They were to be left with Hallie's mother near Cincinnati. Even in that tiny shack, leaning so close to the fire you could smell the heat in her dress, her eyes did not pick up a flicker of light. They were like 2 wells into which he had trouble gazing. Even punched out, they needed to be covered, lidded, marked with some sign to warn folks of what that emptiness held. So he looked instead at the fire while she told him, because her husband was not there for the telling. Mr. Garner was dead, and his wife had a lump in her neck the size of a sweet potato and unable to speak to anyone. She leaned as close to the fire as her pregnant belly allowed and told him, Paul D., the last of the Sweet Home men. There had been 5 of them who belonged to the farm, Setha, the only female. Mrs. Garner, crying like a baby, had sold his brother to pay off the debts that surfaced the minute she was widowed. Then schoolteacher arrived to put things in order, but what he did broke 3 more Sweet Home men and punched the glittering iron out of Setha's eyes, leaving 2 open wells that did not reflect firelight. Now the iron was back, but the face, softened by hair, made him trust her enough to step inside her door, smack into a pool of pulsing red light. She was right. It was sad. Walking through it, a wave of grief soaked him so thoroughly he wanted to cry. It seemed a long way to the normal light surrounding the table, but he made it dry-eyed and lucky. You said she died soft as cream, he reminded her. Oh, that's not baby Suggs, she said. Well, who then? My daughter. The one I sent ahead with the boys? She didn't live? No. The one I was carrying when I run away is all I got left. Boy's gone too. Both of them walked off just before baby Suggs died. Paul D. looked at the spot where the grief had soaked him. The red was gone, but a kind of weeping clung to the air where it had been. Probably best, he thought. If a Negro got legs, he ought to use them. Sit down too long, somebody will figure out a way to tie him up. Still, if her boys were gone, no man, you here by yourself? Me in Denver, she said. That all right by you? That's all right by me. She saw his skepticism and went on. I cook at a restaurant in town, and I sew a little on the sly. Paul D. smiled then, remembering the bedding dress. Setha was 13 when she came to Sweet Home and already iron-eyed. She was a timely present for Mrs. Garner, who had lost baby Suggs to her husband's high principles. The 5 Sweet Home men looked at the new girl and decided to let her be. They were young and so sick with the absence of women they had taken to calves. Yet they let the iron-eyed girl be, so she could choose, in spite of the fact that each one would have beaten the others to mush to have her. It took her a year to choose, a long, tough year of thrashing on pallets, eaten up with dreams of her, a year of yearning when rape seemed the solitary gift of life, the restraint they exercised possible only because they were the Sweet Home men. And so they were Paul D. Garner, Paul F. Garner, Paul A. Garner, Hallie Suggs, and Sixo, all in their 20s, minus women, bucking cows, dreaming of rape, thrashing on pallets, rubbing their thighs, and waiting for the new girl, the one who took baby Suggs' place after Hallie bought her, with 5 years of Sundays. Maybe that was why she chose him. A 20-year-old man so in love with his mother he gave up 5 years of Sabbaths just to see her sit down for a change was a serious recommendation. She waited a year, and the Sweet Home men abused cows while they waited with her, and she chose Hallie, and for their first bedding, she sewed herself a dress on the sly. Won't you stay on a while? Can't nobody catch up on 18 years in a day. Out of the dimness of the room in which they sat, a white staircase climbed toward the blue and white wallpaper of the second floor. Paul D. could see just the beginning of the paper, discrete flecks of yellow sprinkled among a blizzard of snowdrops all backed by blue. The luminous white of the railing and steps kept him glancing toward it ever since he had told him the air above the stairwell was charmed and very thin. But the girl who walked down out of that air was round and brown with the face of an alert doll. Paul D. looked at the girl and then at Setha, who smiled, saying, Here she is, my Denver. This is Paul D., honey, from Sweet Home. Good morning, Mr. D. Garner, baby. Paul D. Garner. Yes, sir. I'm glad to get a look at you. Last time I saw your mama, you were pushing out the front of her dress. Still is, Seth smiled, provided she can get in it. Denver stood on the bottom step and was suddenly hot and shy. It had been a long time since anybody, good-willed white woman, preacher, speaker, or newspaper man sat at their table, their sympathetic voices called liar by the revulsion in their eyes. For 12 years, long before Grandma Baby died, there'd been no visitors of any sort, and certainly no friends. Then his Bentley. Someone her mother wanted to talk to and would even consider talking to while barefoot. Looking, in fact, acting like a girl instead of the quiet, queenly woman she had known all her life. The one who never looked away, who when a man got stomped to death by a mare right in front of Sawyer's restaurant didn't look away. And when a sow began eating her own litter, didn't look away then either. And when the baby's spirit picked up Here Boy and slammed him into the wall hard enough to break 2 of his legs and dislocate his eye so hard he went into convulsions and chewed up his tongue, still her mother had not looked away. She'd taken a hammer, knocked the dog unconscious, wiped away the blood and saliva, pushed his eye back in his head and set his leg bones. He recovered, mute and off balance, more because of his untrustworthy eye than his bent legs. And winter, summer, drizzle or dry, nothing could persuade him to enter that house again. Now here was this woman with the presence of mind to repair a dog gone savage with pain, rocking her crossed ankles and looking away from her own daughter's body as though the size of it was more than vision could bear. And neither he nor she had on shoes. Hot, shy, now Denver was lonely. All that leaving, first her brothers, then her grandmother, serious losses since there were no children willing to circle her in a game or hang by their knees from her porch railing. None of that had mattered as long as her mother didn't look away as she was doing now, making Denver long, downright long, for a sign of spite from the baby ghost. She's a fine-looking young lady, said Paul D. Fine-looking. She got her daddy's sweet face. You knew my father? Knew him. Knew him well. Did he, ma'am? Denver fought an urge to realign her affection. Of course he knew your daddy. I told you. He's from Sweet Home. Denver sat down on the bottom step. There was nowhere else gracefully to go. They were twosome, saying your daddy and Sweet Home in a way that made it clear both belonged to them and not to her, that her own father's absence was not hers. Once the absence had belonged to Grandma Baby, a son deeply mourned because he was the one who had brought her out of there. Then it was her mother's absent husband. Now it was this hazelnut stranger's absent friend. Only those who knew him could claim his absence for themselves, just as only those who lived on Sweet Home could remember it, whisper it, and glance sideways at one another while they did. Again she wished for the baby ghost, its anger thrilling her now where it used to wear her out. We have a ghost in here, she said. And it worked. They were not a twosome anymore. Her mother left off swinging her feet and being girlish. Memory of Sweet Home dropped away from the eyes of the man she was being girlish for. He looked quickly up the lightning white stairs behind her. So I hear, he said, but sad, your mama said, not evil. No, sir, said Denver, not evil, but not sad either. Well, what then? Rebuked, lonely, and rebuked? Is that right? Paul D. turned to Setha. Well, I don't know about lonely, said Denver's mother. Mad, maybe, but I don't see how it could be lonely, spending every minute with us like it does. Must be something you got at once. Setha shrugged. Just a baby. My sister, said Denver. She died in this house. Paul D. scratched the hair under his jaw. You know, that reminds me of that headless bride back behind Sweet Home. You remember that, Setha? Used to roam those woods just as regular. Oh, how could I forget? Worrisome. How come everybody run off from Sweet Home? Can't stop talking about it. Looked like if it was so sweet, you would have stayed. Girl, who you talking to? Paul D. laughed. It's true. She's right, Seth. It wasn't sweet, and it sure wasn't home. He shook his head. But it's where we were, said Seth, all together. Comes back whether we wanted to or not. She shivered a little. A light ripple of skin on her arm as she caressed back into sleep. Denver, she said, start up that stove. I can't have a friend stop by and don't beat him. Oh, don't go to any trouble on my account, Paul D. said. Bread ain't trouble. The rest I brought back from where I work. The least I can do, cooking from dawn to noon, is bring dinner home. You got any objections to Pike? If he don't object to me, I don't object to him. At it again, thought Denver, her back to them. She jostled the kindling and almost lost the fire. Why don't you spend the night, Mr. Garner? You and Ma'am can talk about Sweet Home all night long. Setha took 2 swift steps to the stove, but before she could yank Denver's collar, the girl leaned forward and began to cry. What's the matter with you? I never knew you to behave this way. Oh, leave her be, said Paul D. I'm a stranger to her. That's just it. She got no cause to act up with a stranger. Oh, baby, what is it? Did something happen? But Denver was shaking now and sobbing, so she couldn't speak. The tears she had not shed for 9 years, wetting her far too womanly breasts. I can't no more. I can't no more. Can't what? What can't you? I can't live here. I don't know where to go or what to do, but I can't live here. Nobody speaks to us. Nobody comes by. Boys don't like me. Girls don't either. Honey. What's she talking about? Nobody speaks to you, asked Paul D. Where's the house? People don't. It's not the house. It's us and it's you, Denver. Leave off, Setha. It's hard for a young girl living in a haunted house. That can't be easy. Well, it's easier than some other things. Oh, thanks, Setha. I'm a grown man with nothing new left to see or do. And I'm telling you, it ain't easy. Maybe you all ought to move. Who owns this house? Over Denver's shoulder, Setha shot Paul D. a look of snow. What you care? Well, they won't let you leave? No, Setha. No moving. No leaving. It's all right the way it is. You gonna tell me it's all right with this child half out of her mind? Something in the house braced, and in the listening quiet that followed, Setha spoke. I got a tree on my back, and a hayne in my house, and nothing in between but the daughter I am holding in my arms. No more running from nothing. I will never run from another thing on this earth. I took one journey, and I paid for the ticket, but let me tell you something, Paul D. Garner, it costs too much. You hear me? It costs too much. Now you sit down and eat with us, or you leave us be. Paul D. fished in his vest for a little pouch of tobacco, concentrating on its contents and the knot of its string, while Setha led Denver into the keeping room that opened off the large room he was sitting in. He had no smoking papers, so he fiddled with the pouch and listened through the open door to Setha quieting her daughter. When she came back, she avoided his look and went straight to a small table next to the stove. Her back was to him, and he could see all the hair he wanted without the distraction of her face. What tree on your back? Setha put a bowl on the table and reached under it for flour. What tree on your back? Is something growing on your back? I don't see nothing growing on your back. Well, it's there all the same. Who told you that? White girl, that's what she called it. I've never seen it and never will, but that's what she said it looked like. A choke cherry tree. Trunk, branches, and even leaves. Tiny little choke cherry leaves. But that was 18 years ago. It could have cherries too now, for all I know. Setha took a little spit from the tip of her tongue with her forefinger, Quickly, lightly, she touched the stove. Then she trailed her fingers through the flour, parting, separating small hills and ridges of it, looking for mites. Finding none, she poured soda and salt into the crease of her folded hand and tossed both into the flour. Then she reached into a can and scooped half a handful of lard. Deftly, she squeezed the flour through it. Then with her left hand sprinkling water, she formed the dough. "I had milk," she said. "I was pregnant with Denver, but I had milk for my baby girl. I hadn't stopped nursing her when I sent her on ahead with Howard and Bugler." Now she rolled the dough out with a wooden pen. Anybody could smell me long before he saw me. And when he saw me, he'd see the drops of it on the front of my dress. Nothing I could do about that. All I knew was I had to get my milk to my baby girl. Nobody was going to nurse her like me. Nobody was going to get it to her fast enough or take it away when she had enough and didn't know it. Nobody knew that she couldn't pass her air if you held her up on your shoulder, only if she was lying on my knees. Nobody knew that but me, and nobody had her milk but me. I told that to the women in the wagon, told them to put sugar water and cloth to suck from, so when I got there in a few days, she wouldn't have forgot me. The milk would be there, and I would be there with it. "Men don't know nothing much," said Paul D., tucking his pouch back into his vest pocket. "But they do know a suckling can't be taken away from its breast alone. Well, then they know what it's like to send your children off when your breasts are full." We was talking about a tree, Setha. After I left you, those boys came in there and took my milk. That's what they came in there for. They tied me up and they took it. I told Mrs. Garner on them. She had that lump and she couldn't speak, but her eyes rolled out tears. Them boys found out I told on them. The school teacher made one open up my back, and when it closed, it made a tree. It grows there still. They used cowhide on you, and they took my milk. They beat you and you was pregnant, and they took my milk. The fat white circles of dough lined the pan in rows. Once more, Setha touched a wet forefinger to the stove. She opened the oven door and slid the pan of biscuits in. As she raised up from the heat, she felt Paul D. behind her and his hands under her breasts. She straightened up, but knew, but could not feel, that his cheek was pressing into the branches of her choked cherry tree. Not even trying, he had become the kind of man who could walk into a house and make the women cry, because with him, in his presence, they could. There was something blessed in his manner. Women saw him and wanted to weep, to tell him that their chest hurt and their knees did too. Strong women and wise saw him and told him things they only told each other, that way past the change of life. Desire in them had suddenly become enormous, greedy, more savage than when they were 15, and it embarrassed them and made them sad. That secretly they longed to die, to be quit of it, that sleep was more precious to them than any waking day. Young girls sidled up to him to confess or describe how well dressed the visitations were that had followed them straight from their dreams. Therefore, although he did not understand why this was so, he was not surprised when Denver dripped tears into the stove fire. Nor 15 minutes later, after telling him about her stolen milk, her mother wept as well. Behind her, bending down, his body an arc of kindness, he held her breasts in the palms of his hands. He rubbed his cheek on her back and learned that way her sorrow, the roots of it, its wide trunk and intricate branches. Raising his fingers to the hooks of her dress, he knew without seeing them or hearing any sigh that the tears were coming fast. And when the top of her dress was around her hips and he saw the sculpture her back had become, like the decorative work of an ironsmith too passionate for display, he could think but not say, "Oh, Lord, girl." and he would tolerate no peace until he had touched every ridge and leaf of it with his mouth, none of which Setha could feel, because her back skin had been dead for years. What she knew was that the responsibility for her breasts at last was in somebody else's hands. Would there be a little space, she wondered, a little time, some way to hold off eventfulness, to push busyness into the corners of the room and just stand there a minute or two, naked from shoulder blade to waist, relieved of the weight of her breasts, smelling the stolen milk again and the pleasure of baking bread. Maybe this one time she could stop dead still in the middle of a cooking meal, not even leave the stove, and feel the hurt her back ought to, trust things and remember things, because the last of the Sweet Home Men was there to catch her if she sank.